And of course, Josephus was not a very nice character, really.
Mm-hmm.
He was a Jewish traitor. He worked for the Romans. He was very vainglorious, egotistical. He only ever worked for himself. And he only ever tried to portray himself in the best of light. So he was not exactly the best of characters to be writing the New Testament.
So, I mean, what was his motives in regards to this then?
He was cheated out of... I'm under the impression, having researched this a great deal, that he was actually related to Jesus. These were all important characters, of course. Let's get aside this idea that Jesus was a carpenter.
Right.
He was a king, and he was the high priest of Jerusalem. And in fact, the letters of Saul make it abundantly clear that he became high priest of Jerusalem.
Mm-hmm.
So these were important characters, and I think that Saul Josephus was actually related to the same family. Now, he lost out. There was an election. He lost out. He was not voted because they didn't trust him, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Just as it says in the New Testament that they did not trust Saul. And so he lost his position. He was scorned. And he basically wanted to get his own back. So he didn't get the support of Jesus and James. So he went to Vespasian instead.
Mm-hmm.
So he went to the Romans and got their support. And so he led a counter-revolution against the revolutionaries. Jesus and James being the revolutionaries.
Right.
Using the Romans as his private sort of army. And of course he won. So, yes, it puts a rather different spin on the New Testament story.
It definitely does. And, I mean, what would you say is the main motive for kind of embedding the story like this? Meaning, what I'm talking about here is the fact that, Jesus, as you said, was just a poor, a carpenter, everyday man, so to speak. But, a matter of fact, what you have found here is that these are kings. They have armies at their disposal, so to speak. But why embed the story in a totally different light, so to speak?
Because it gives it's a much easier story to sell. Yeah, you look at every fairy story in the world for children, and it's always about some pauper who rises to become a prince or a king,
right?
Queen. Cinderella's and all these stories. It's all about people who start from lowly beginnings and become very important. It's an easy story to sell. It's a sob story.
Mm.
And I think this was the reason for it.
But I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but wouldn't they kind of, if you know what I'm saying, getting trouble along the way? Because at that time there should have been people around knowing what actually had been going on and try to counter this information and say no, this was actually not what was going on.
Oh yes, well there was. I mean, the Talmud clearly says that. The Talmud makes that perfectly clear. So there were counter stories. But remember, when it came to the Council of Nicaea in what was it, 325 A.D.
Right.
Under Constantine, of course, any of those stories that countered the New Testament story could easily be deleted, and they were. So, I mean, if you read the Talmud, the Talmud says that Scripture says that you shall not spare, nor shall you conceal the revolutionary, basically.
Mm-hmm.
However, it goes on to say, with Jesus the Nazarene, it was different, for he was connected with the government and with royalty.
There we go.
So you get all along through the Talmud, if you read the Talmud, you get these hints that they were of the royalty.
Right.
For instance, it says of Mary of Bethany. I don't know if you know Mary of Bethany from the lady who anointed Jesus
right.
as king. Well, that was actually Mary Magdalene. It's quite clear that was Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But the Talmud says, of course, that this Mary, that's Mary Magdalene, was the richest woman in Judea.
Yeah.
Now, again, there's a bit of a difference, isn't there, between what we are led to believe and what the Talmud actually says.
Exactly.
She was the daughter of Simon of Boethus. And, of course, the Mary and Martha lived in the house of Simon, so it's the same story. And the Talmud is quite clear that Simon of Boethus was the richest man in Judea. between him and his two partners, they boasted that they could keep Jerusalem under siege. They could keep Jerusalem going for 10 years. Their assets.
Really? So these are very wealthy. They're merchants. They have a lot of people at their disposal, so to speak, and in many cases kings also. I mean, what I want to ask you is does this new book of yours here, King Jesus, does this pick up from where your previous book, so to speak, left off? The Jesus, the last of the pharaohs, and that he was, grand.
It actually picks up. Well, it picks up on Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs. Jesus, Last of the Pharaohs was a book that gave an overview of the position.
Right.
It basically was saying that Jesus was an Egyptian prince, in exile, of course, but he was most definitely related somehow to the Egyptian royal line.
Yeah.
But I didn't know where. And then that was continued with the book called Cleopatra to Christ. Right. And that made it quite clear that Jesus was actually related to Queen Cleopatra. He was the great-grandson of Queen Cleopatra. And that comes through a long-lost story, again from Josephus, about a strange queen who was Queen of Persia. Now, we don't exactly know who this queen was, but she was given to the king of Persia, Phraates IV, by Augustus, the Roman emperor. Now, it says in Josephus that she was a prostitute. However, you would not give as a diplomatic present a prostitute to a foreign king, not unless you wanted to provoke a war, of course. But this so-called prostitute was so inspired by the king of Persia that he made her his chief wife, and her son became king of Persia. It's quite clear that this woman was very, very important, and if you trace the history back, it does appear that she was the daughter of Queen Cleopatra. Because Augustus had already done this with Cleopatra's other daughter. That was Cleopatra Selene, who was the other daughter of Cleopatra, and she was given to another king, this time Juba II of Mauritania.
Right.
So he was giving diplomatic brides away to the kings on his boundaries that he obviously liked or wanted to keep sweet. And this was a daughter of Queen Cleopatra. However, this particular queen, although she became queen of Persia, she did upset the locals, and she was kicked out of Persia. The Queen of Persia and her son, some 200 courtiers and a whole army, were exiled to the borders of Syria and Persia. So they were on the borders right between the two, between Judea and Persia, and they were exiled in AD 4. So this is exactly the same time as the New Testament says that obviously Jesus was born, and the whole of the New Testament story starts.
Right, right.
Of course, if we look into the New Testament, the birth of Jesus was accompanied by the three wise men, and the three wise men, of course, were the Magi, Magi from Persia. Now, the Magi were actually the Persian priesthood and the Persian kingmakers as well. So why were the Persians interested in a supposedly, Jewish carpenter born in Judea? The New Testament doesn't make that clear at all. But of course, if we have this new history, then it makes perfect sense, because this family, this child, was a child of an Egyptian mother. She was a daughter or a granddaughter of Cleopatra, and she was also half Persian,
right,
to Phraates IV, because she was married to, or her mother had been married to Phraates IV of Persia.
And was her father also Julius Caesar then, the Roman Empire emperor?
Yes. Well, that's the lady we're talking about was the daughter of Cleopatra, and her father was Julius Caesar.
Right.
Now, this is not explicitly given in the Roman record, but it is recorded that when Cleopatra fled Rome on the death of Julius Caesar, that she was pregnant. And there was a great flurry of alarm within Rome at the time, because the last thing they wanted was an Egyptian prince to become king, as it were, of Rome.
Right.
And so they were all upset by this, and there was a great kerfuffle. And finally, after several months, the issue died down, the alarm died down. And the question is, why did it do that? And, this pregnancy is never mentioned again.
Really?
Now, the obvious reason for this problem ending itself was the child was not a boy. Under Roman law, you could only become emperor, of course, if you were male. And so if this child had been born female, then the problem had solved itself. And so it seems likely that Cleopatra actually had another child by Julius Caesar. And this was the young princess who was eventually sent to Persia by Augustus Caesar about 20 years later or so as a diplomatic bride, because he wanted to ease tensions with Phraates IV of Persia. So this had to be a very special bride, otherwise he would not have eased the tensions between the two empires. And the most suitable diplomatic bride, of course, would have been a daughter of Cleopatra.
Cleopatra, right.
This is why I say that this particular lady, and her name is Thea Musa Orania, this is why I say that she was the lost daughter of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar.
Right.
And this is the lady that gets thrown out of Persia some 20 years later, in her 40s, in AD 4, and sets up a new city-state, pretty much, on the borders of Judea and Syria. Now, this city-state that she set up was called Orania, and it's still called that now, actually.
Really?
After her name, because her name was Thea Musa Orania.
Right.
And significantly, if you translate that into English, the kingdom of Orania becomes the kingdom of heaven.
Isn't that interesting, huh?
So here we have this new city-state being set up with a queen who's half Egyptian and half... a queen who's Egyptian and half Roman, and her children would have been half Persian. And of course this is why, and I think her daughter was in fact Mary the Virgin as we would know her. This is why the Persian magi, the Persian priests, would have come to see the birth of any child of this family, because potentially, of course, he was a prince of Persia.
So what you're saying here is that potentially the three magi, they were coming and going in every time a new child of this family was born. That's what you're saying.
Yeah, well, the magi were also the kingmakers. One of their roles, I mean, they were the astrologers and the priesthood of the Persians, but one of their roles was to discover the new king of Persia. Obviously, when a king dies, as Phraates IV did, there are many children to choose from, and it's up to the Magi to divine the next rightful ruler of Persia.
Right.
One of the princes, obviously, they visited was Jesus, because he was half Persian and half Egyptian.
And how did the Persian Empire look at the time? Was this under the rule of Rome? I mean,
This was the biggest threat to Rome that there was, the Eastern Empire against Persia. Rome had lost 3 battles, and 2 of their emblems had been stolen by the Persians. They were the biggest threat to Rome at this time.